Yes. With the insurance companies always say something like that.
Acts of God.
Yeah. So we have honored today to have Kyleanne Hunter. Dr. Hunter, she received her PhD at the University of Denver in the Korbel School of International Studies. Student chair of your committee was Debbie Avon, for those who might know her work. She is here today, of course, to talk about the integration of women in Western militaries and the link between integration and effectiveness, which I think is a great one, although there are all kinds of issues about the domestic impact on gender relations in military effectiveness, etc. So.
You're giving away everything we're talking about.
There you go.
Don't go on to questions.
I didn't tell you what the findings actually were, which is good because I don't know them. But I know that if anybody knows the answers, it's probably Dr. Hunter, given that she served in multiple tours as a combat helicopter pilot, flying the Super Cobra, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So her combination of kind of academic training combined with real world, I would say practical experience, promises that us that this will be a very interesting talk. She'll talk for about half an hour, and then we'll have Q&A, which she'll handle herself. Last thing I'll mention, two last things. So I guess neither one is the last thing. She is an SFS alum, so coming back to the Hilltop. And of course, she is teaching currently SCST 500, maybe teaching it again in the spring, but definitely teaching a course called Gender and War in the spring. And we're very excited about that. So when registration comes, have your eye out for that. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, recognize a few faces, so it's always good. This is, again, a combination, what I'm going to talk about today, from my experiences, both as a helicopter pilot, but then also I was the Marine Corps' legislative liaison officer to the House, and so I spent my last 3 years in the Marine Corps doing a lot of oversight for the Armed Services Committee on our NATO operations in Afghanistan in particular, and so that's where a lot of these questions started bubbling up from. Also, my work, I'm the chair of the Employment and Integration Subcommittee for the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. So that's the Secretary of Defense's advisory group on what's happening. So some of our work there. And then also my academic dissertation work. This comes from part of that. But rather than making this just a purely academic talk, a la like job market presentation talk, I wanted to focus more on what are some of the practical implications that rise from the fact that there are variations of integration of the way that women are used in the military, and why does it matter? Why do we think about it? I know most people in this room are here to be practitioners. They're here to go back out into a variety of different fields, and almost regardless of what that field is, gender integration is something that is going to touch everyone's life in some way. And I think, let's see if this works, if I'm good at, oh yeah. So why does it matter? Why are we even talking about this right now? We thought, oh, it's done. We've lifted the combat exclusion on women. Women are integrated. We have women who are in just about every military occupational specialty. We've had women finish Ranger School in the US. The head of the Norwegian forces in Afghanistan is a woman. So why do we talk about this? Well, still today, from even a leadership perspective, there are questions as to what women in the services means. The jury is out on it, in the words of Secretary Mattis here. But what's interesting when we think about this is that, the idea that, women are charging into it, but there are too few. So this, I like this statement because it raises a lot of questions. So is this a numbers game? Is success of integration of women a numbers game? Do we need a certain amount of women? Does it have to do with timing, duration that they're in? Or is there something else? Is there some other effective means beyond just a number of women that are included in the military that matters? Can we look at really what success means? So we have, these are representative photos from when I was, a lot of them were out from when I was doing field work in Norway, but other ones just of what French, US, and Norwegian women. So just for a little background, my academic work looks at comparisons between the United States, France, and Norway with regards to both their process by which they integrate women, but also then in turn the effectiveness and the way they measure effectiveness of women's integration on their operations in Afghanistan. And looked at those 3 countries because Afghanistan actually provided a nice natural experiment that in academia we always like when it works out beautifully, that we have, oh look, here are 3 countries that had the same overarching strategic goal, strategic mission, but went about their operations very differently. They are also 3 countries that intentionally talked about women being part of those operations, but did so in a very different manner. And so they provided a nice natural sort of divide to look at there, which is one of the great things when it works out well. So what are we going to talk about today? And what do I really want to focus on today? 3 things. One, looking at how do we commonly think about why women are recruited and brought into the military? And then really, what does that say about the way we think about women in the military and their effectiveness? So what is that? What's the state of the literature? What do we know? How do we research that? The next is, how are we measuring women's effectiveness? What does it mean when we say that it is effective to have women in the military? That's something that we hear a lot. Or ineffective, from the negative. What do we say when it means it harms military effectiveness to integrate women? So what are we actually talking about and measuring that? And then what are these assumptions that we're making that are leading to these findings? And then how's that going to actually impact our day-to-day lives? Why do we make this? And are these assumptions the same that we hold? So if we think about why women get integrated into the military to begin with, there's sort of 3 broad range of thought here. The first is this needs of the warfighting mission. And this can vary. This goes back to the free a man to fight idea of recruiting women into things like the auxiliary services during massive wars. That, okay, we need everybody to participate. It can also mean things like specifically recruiting women to engage with other women in counterinsurgency missions. But it really comes down to there's some military need, whether that is a wide scale, all hands on deck, we're fighting a total war and we need just every citizen to do something to contribute, or there's something very specific about a woman based on gender roles in society that we need her to actually go do this tactical thing. However, to explain like our modern era here, this one really falls short. If you look at Afghanistan in particular, and Western militaries and Afghanistan in particular, this whole idea of just needs of going to war doesn't necessarily hold true. The first you see that despite the fact, and this is like really this top bullet here is looking at variation, you see a convergence between our Western countries on a lot of tactical doctrine, whether that's the way we use air power, the way we do mission planning for air-ground integration, sea integration, the tactical lift and logistics of getting stuff to troops. However, there continues to be a divergence in the way that women are brought into various militaries. So if it was really just the needs of war fighting, you would see convergence on the way women are integrated between all of these Western countries because, theoretically we're fighting the same wars right now. We're fighting more and more the same wars. And yet they remain divergent. The way both that women are employed and the way that they're even talked about within the military. And the other thing is that overall, you're seeing a decrease in the sizes of militaries in the Western world, despite the fact that you're seeing a ramp up in their tactical employment. And so you're seeing a increased technologicalization of the military. So it's not just we need bodies and manpower, and you're seeing a decrease in overall actual like one-on-one kind of tactical use interaction between soldiers and foreign troop size. And particularly if you look at the sociological work of people like Maddie Siegel, who looks at when you see this big ramping up of women in the military, it tends to be when you just need a lot of bodies, because then it becomes okay to bring women into this typically masculine organization. And so that kind of explains away just we need people to fight. Economic drivers are another explanation of why women are recruited into or allowed to, or are brought into the military in higher levels. And this is primarily done in conjunction with high male employment rates. So when the economy is good, and you look at Western, again we're looking at the Western militaries, and even those that have some form of conscription, it's a limited conscription. There's very few militaries anymore that actually every single person has to serve in the Western world. I mean, South Korea would be, if we want to call them a modern Western military, and Israel would be the outliers there. But even places like Norway that do have a universal conscription, it means just that everybody's eligible to. You can pull yourself out of the pool for a variety of reasons, and being employed by a government sector is one of those reasons. And so women, employment tends to be one of these explanations, these drivers. However, if we look at the period during which Afghanistan was taking place, you saw one of the highest male unemployment rates in the Western world, kind of concurrent with economic crises. And so a labor pool available to go fight clearly isn't an explanation that leads to this variation in this increase that we see. And the next is just this idea that women joining the military is just a reflection of general women's acceptance into society. That as women take on more and more roles in the workforce, they're more and more engaged in technology, that the military is just another employer. So it's sort of this domestic idea that this is where the woman is. And back in my backup slides, I can show you all the nice little graphs and regression analysis for anybody who's really interested in that. But if you look at this among the Western world, it actually also doesn't hold true. You have countries like France and Belgium that have very high levels of integration of women into their militaries, and yet still have a very low overall participation of women's workforce, particularly in what we think of as non-traditional roles for women. And you can contrast that with places like Spain and Italy that actually have a very high level of women in what we think of as non-traditional roles. So these are things like other emergency services, so like police and fire, the hard sciences, the automotive mechanic field. So you have a high level of women in those, but still very, very low levels of women's participation in the military. So it doesn't quite line up. Yes, you can kind of think overall general trends, but looking at this variation, it's not saying that, okay, the countries that have women in technological fields and women who are mechanics and women who are in the police are also seeing women in the military. And so all of this really this is what kind of led to my puzzle of this research of thinking why do we see this variation? And whether it was when I was over fighting and observing this, or when I was over doing oversight stuff for the Armed Services Committee, it's something that came up a lot. That was just very observable. That that there is this difference between the NATO countries that are there fighting. And so what explains it? The other thing that becomes a puzzle for this is, what do we mean when we study the effectiveness of women in the military? And this was another puzzle that kept coming up, and I would sit around and ponder, especially as I started grad school. And as a little background on myself too, I always say that people go to get PhDs for two different reasons. There's one group of people who are just really smart, and then there's the other group of people who are trying to figure out something that happened to them in their life and want the tools to it. I think I feel like in the latter, because as I read more and more, I was like, I don't understand what is happening. And so I need to go write the book about it, literally. And when we look at effectiveness, again, there are three ways that effectiveness tends to be measured in the academic literature, and then also in the policy world literature. And this is something that on Dakowitz, I rip my hair out about, almost at every meeting. The first is this whole idea of number of women in the military. That there's somehow some magical number that if we get to, maybe it's 10%. And then it was maybe it's 30%. Well, maybe it's 50%. That's directly reflective of the of the population will magically have integration. And that then again, especially as militaries are becoming more technologically advanced, more precise on their type of missions, while also shifting away from just being a bunch of guys with guns who are charging each other on an open field and whoever has more people left standing is the winner. This idea that it's just a game of numbers always really bothered me, because in no other measure of military effectiveness do we just say it's a game of numbers. Do we just say if we get X amount of anything, of pilots, or X amount of tanks, or X amount of ships, that's what it is. It has to do with this idea of mission dependence that we have to have. So but a lot of the literature really just looks at, okay, who has the most women? It also frustrates me because it doesn't really tell a real story. If you look at Hungary, for example, because the NATO, so if anybody's interested in this, NATO actually has started publishing some really good reports on women's integration into the military. But if you look at Hungary, they look like, if it's just a pure numbers game, the best. They have 24% of their military is women. So you're like, all right, like on the surface, if you're looking at numbers, you're like, oh, they're doing something right. If you dig in a little deeper, there are no female officers. There's actually no woman who's above the rank of E3. So for those of you who are familiar, that's like, it's a very junior enlisted rank. Women actually aren't allowed to obtain a rank beyond E3. And there are no women who are things other than clerks, nurses, or drivers. So are you really integrating women? Is numbers really what we're looking at? And do numbers matter? That's the question I was looking at. The next is that they say, okay, so maybe it's just not the number of women writ large, the other effectiveness. How many women do we have in the combat arms? So this is the idea of infantry, tanks, artillery. I mean, some people would put in parts of aviation into that. Some people would put submarines into that, intelligence, reconnaissance, this idea that, okay, maybe it's not just women in the military at large, but what does it mean to have women in this, what we think of as like the main effort, the kind of pinnacle of the military. Well, again, this becomes a bit problematic because we talked about mission dependency. What is the purpose of the military? But then it also starts to raise questions of how do different countries look at the roles of their militaries? When you have a country like the United States, where combat effectiveness is very much both the internal and external value of the military. This idea that the military exists to go win wars. And that's being in the infantry is a major part of that. Versus a country like Norway, whose military really still exists as a citizenship model. That it's a very internally focused dynamic, that the signaling that the military is doing is more to its own citizenry. That by including women and integrating women, what it's really doing is escalating the idea that women are equal citizens, versus we think of our military as great when they go win wars. And even to the point where we were over, I was over in Norway about 2.5 years ago doing some of the field work for this, and I was with a few other veterans, and they had a bunch of soldiers were coming back from Afghanistan. And they, one of them was, they had a big deal made about him over here for the work that he had done as a sniper. And there was a question raised, like, well, why aren't you celebrating him? Why aren't you doing something big in the media for him? And the generals looked at us like we were crazy. That was like, that's not, the Norwegian people don't want to hear about that. That's not the purpose of our military. They want them to come back and be good Norwegians. So there's this whole different idea that what does it mean to be, even to be a soldier, and what parts of the military are more valued than others. So this idea of combat arms becomes a little tricky when you look at effectiveness. And then the other, they look at I couldn't even spell there, but the idea of women in leadership positions. If you get women high enough, maybe it's just, you have women in a few key roles. But this then starts to raise questions, and I don't know, did Jeanette Haney get to come ever talk here?
I can't remember at a lunch or not. But
okay. Yeah, so if you had Jeanette, who is, okay, we were fellow, we used to joke that it's like the Cobra pilot to PhD pipeline that you have there, because we were pilots together, but she looked a lot at what does it actually mean to be a woman in the military was a big focus of her role. And this then raised questions of, if you have a female, somebody who happens to be biologically female, who acts in a, what you consider a masculine way to obtain a leadership position, sort of like the Margaret Thatcher, questions that arise, from it. That, what does it mean to be a woman in the military? And there's a lot of work done on this, that more and more women, and so many that I interviewed among many other people who obtained senior leadership positions, whether it's on the officer or the enlisted side, they openly talk about how they didn't, they acted like a man to do it, and like they will use those terms. And so what are we really talking about integration if you're still holding the same norms, the same values, the same, or you're not changing anything about the institution? That you're just adopting the trappings of the institution as it was. Is it actually impacting women that we have? And so this led to this whole idea that from those questions I came from the why, what's this puzzle that exists around, because we see all of these differences. And here's a little bit on the differences that we see between the US, Norway, and France, both with regards to tactical experiences in Afghanistan. But then as I started to dig deeper, you also see there's very different experiences that women have, like at home, domestically. And so this again raises the question of what is the purpose of integration, and how is it effective? So just a real quick, and we can go into more detail, and I'm sure there's people who are even more experts than I am on this in this room. So in Afghanistan, in the United States, you saw the women primarily used as female engagement teams. They were tactically attached to infantry units, which the terminology becomes very important, because at the time when the bulk of the time this was going on, there was still formally a combat exclusion. And so language was used to get around specific laws. But you saw women attached for very specific reasons. They had often received different training leading up to it. They were used for a reason and then brought out. And this actually caused a lot of problems back at home. I mean, there were congressional hearings over women dying for this. And there was actually a moratorium put on this for a while because of the fact that women died when we needed them for that. And then in Norway, you see really there's no restrictions on any of women's service. There are no restrictions on women being in any infantry, in anything in the Norwegian military. Women and men bunk together starting from the day they start training. But there also then is really no preference given to women for any type of service. Like, they are looked at just as another soldier. So there really is not a gender, despite the fact that there's gender equality, there is no gendered component to their operational planning. They just view how many bodies do we need to go do something. And then in France, again, you don't see restrictions on women's service. Women are integrated into the infantry, but there is a very, very heavy gender component to how they create their units. And they specifically and geographically would create infantry units that had female-heavy personnel to go into certain areas. They would. This was a very intentional planning on their part. And so you can see these differences that are occurring on the ground with the way they're treated and the way that the units are interacting on the ground, and that are also reflected in the differences of experience that women have in their militaries at home. In the United States, there's a lot that you see in the news still today, probably around like unconscious bias, and the Marines United scandal is something that I'm sure everyone has heard of here, and sexual assault in the military, and it being the idea of, is there a toxic masculinity culture that exists here? In Norway, the result ended up being universal conscription. That there actually became a fight, and a bunch of men sued the military that because of what was happening in Afghanistan, women were going and fighting these units just the same, but they still weren't subject to the same conscription that the women were. And so they sued and they won. And the Norwegian government was like, you're right. like women should be conscripted. And so now you have the same, it's just a lottery, for the way their conscription there works, and if your number's drawn, your number's drawn. The end. They also created the Hunter Troop, which is something that's I'm happy to talk about during Q&A. That was sort of an interesting thing to come out of all of this, and why the Norwegians actually are disbanding it for what I think are very Norwegian reasons to disband it. And then in France, what you're seeing now is a very targeted recruitment of women to go into counterterrorism units and to engage in the in counterterrorism because of how a very gendered focus. But they're being recruited as women. They are still undergo the same sort of training as men. There's still a standard to do stuff, but they are expected to dress like women. So they have this strange dichotomy where they go through, infantry or gendarme training, but then they also have like makeup and dress lessons. So it's this very, you see this very different issue. Yeah.
Yeah, question just for both the U.S. for the female engagement teams and for France in the counterinsurgency efforts. Is there a category of other than for the purpose of searching female Muslim female?
Yeah, and so that
suspected.
So that was why the female engagement teams were created, and that was very specific for women, because when we had gone into Afghanistan and then Iraq, the same thing happened. It became very obvious that there is half the population with whom we can't engage when it was an all-male infantry units, and we needed women to actually go search them, talk to them, engage with them. So women were brought in from a variety of different military occupational specialties to actually do this searching, to do this. To go talk to them, engage with them, and we also learned that women also are the ones who tend to know what's going on, in the villages. So it became very successful that way. But they were brought from MOSs outside of the infantry to attach to infantry units that were doing primarily village stability operations at the time for that specific reason. In France, it started out that you just happened to have women in the infantry already. It's still a very small percentage, but there were women. And it became, so in the US, it was a little more deliberate planning to do it this way. In France, it ended up a little more of a happy accident that women happened to be in a few of these infantry units and worked out this way. So then they started to take women from and specifically create companies and regiments that had female heavy personnel in them after they saw it happened. But they, rather than drawing from other MOSs, they drew from women who were already in the infantry when it occurred. So it's a different process based on what the restrictions were. And there are, I think I should also mention, when we talked about the targeted recruitment for the modern threats that exist, this isn't all like happy. Not everybody, again, loves this. Women are starting now to complain that they are a exploited labor source because of this, and that they are being put into harm's way because they are women. And that's creating some tensions now within the French Ministry of Defense as to are we disproportionately trying to harm one group of people because of some innate characteristic of them, which is an issue in and of itself. And so that's to say we see differences both with how they engage on a very tactical level and how they experience the military at home. And in the interest of time, okay, so these are just some of our short films. I'll be happy to work on that more later. The other thing that the current theories have is they tend to look at all Western militaries as one homogeneous lump. So I was trying to get over this slide, actually before the last one, so we got over it. So how I went about looking at this was to take integration and break it down into an impact-based process. Then rather than just looking at, how many women were involved, how many women were in leadership positions, what did women actually do, to look at what were women's impacts on military strategy and tactics, and then how was that related to what we think of as overall strategic and tactical success. And I looked at sort of a interactive three parts of military service. Structural conditions, so what are the laws, what's actually allowed for women to do, what are the parameters within which we have to operate, because one of the biggest assumptions that we have here is that there are standards that exist and they need to be there and they're there for a reason, and so we're not trying to say that there shouldn't be any standards, so that matters. What is the idea of functional participation by women? So what do they actually do and engage in, and how are they acting? And then finally, what's the durability of women's service? And this is really where the the unique contribution that the committee determined that I made to this world was. But on the how are women, both how long do they last, how long do they stay in the military, but also by durability, what's their lasting impact on the institution? And we have to take as sort of a foundational belief for this that diversity is good for organizations and for organizational learning, and that diversity has a positive impact on the way that organizations think, the way they're structured, their standard operating procedures, and that gender is a variable of diversity that can have a positive impact. And so thinking about durability, are they able to make lasting impacted change because they are women or not? And so here's a little bit of, here's how I broke out the different components looking at all of this, and in my backup slides I've got quantified measures for each of them I can go to, barriers to participation, what actually exists. But then I also looked at childcare and sexual harassment laws, because when we think about gender in particular, these are two structural conditions that can create either seemingly equal or unequal playing fields. Childcare being a big one, because like it or not, the burden of childcare tends to fall on the woman. And this is something that we learned a lot from the work I've done in Dakowitz, that women in submarines, this came up to be a big issue, that when we started to integrate women onto submarines, women wanted to, we started to integrate women into submarines at Kings Bay, which is one of the naval bases. There was no 24-hour childcare available. Like, they just didn't have a 24-hour childcare facility within 100 miles, which put women, because there were a few single mothers who were there, that they either had to not serve night watch, on a sub when you're getting ready to do workups, or hire outside childcare, which is really expensive, especially if you're overnight, or try to work to have some family member come move in. So if you don't have the opportunities to serve on night watch, you're not going to get your warfare qualifications. You don't get your warfare qualifications, you can't deploy. It has nothing to do with whether or not you're actually an effective submariner, but everything to do with the fact that you have some impediment that's actually put there. And so they found this was there was a big case study from France, which is one that I looked at, that in 1979, it was actually written into a Ministry of Defense order that childcare was a national security priority, because if we expected women to serve, that shouldn't be something they think about, worried about. That we should take care. If it's a 24/7 operation, childcare shouldn't be an issue. Just shouldn't come up as an issue. So that fits under this structural condition just because it's a leveling the playing field. Same thing with sexual harassment laws. Basically, is it something that exists, and how is it dealt with? And I can go into more detail of that on question and answer. For functional participation, yes, I did look at how many women you actually have, because that's part of the equation, but not the totality of it. You look at what are women actually doing by occupational specialty, but more what is women's outward-facing role? Because that's when you can start to dig in to actually see their impact on the institution. Are they doing jobs that allow them into places where they can impart meaningful change on the organizational structure, or are they all administrators and drivers? So this is also looking at, are women getting into strategic planning roles? Or are they barred by some other reasons? And so really, how are women engaging with the institution? And then finally, looking at some of the senior roles, but more retention rate, and how commands are structured. And this really gets into, again, the idea of what is the legacy that women are able to impart on the military. And then finally, when you look at the actual, the dependent variable here, is is women's participation created any structural legal provisions that are making it easier for women to serve as women? Are there tactical decisions being made on the basis of gender, that actually change the way that we engage on the ground, and do big strategic decisions take these into play? So there's my nice little model you see. So the big takeaway here is that this is procedural and cyclical, and isn't something we can look at as one snapshot in time. But more importantly, that the claims about service, why women should be serving, and the military culture and structure are going to create either permissive or restrictive environments for this to take place in. And that's where you start to see the differences and the variations that exist. And that if you look at the interaction of these initial claims, and again, more to get into in the Q&A, you see a claim in France where you have this idea that there's a fundamental difference between men and women that exist, and this goes well back into their history, that the role of institutions is to allow for equality with this difference. And French military culture very much lines up with this. That there is this idea that they have this culture of self-learning and reflexivity. A lot of it has to do with getting defeated many times, that maybe they should start to learn something. But also that their strategy is very values-based. Their decision to go intervene, their decision to engage militarily, is based on a lot of their same values that they hold domestically. And so as a result, you have this permissive environment where women act as women. And they engage in a way where they're intentionally brought into places because they're women. In Norway, you have these initial claims around everybody being the same. Just we're all equal. This is very simplifying a lot of it here. And the military that's focused on making citizens. Like that's really the military is seen as a citizenship factory, more or less. And as a result, you have a lot of women who are in the military. None of them will actually say that they serve as women. They serve as soldiers. And the language, the actual Norwegian word for soldier is a completely gender-neutral word. There aren't any qualifiers. And so they're effective at promoting a very flat society, while at the same time, stalling a lot in women actually advancing or changing the way their military exists. The military has been working the same way for a very long time. And in the United States, you have a history of very much individualized equality. That it's about what can each of us do, and the success of, either the success or failure of one isn't necessarily a definitive on the group being useful or not useful. And you also have a military that's very externally focused on winning wars. And so there's not as much space for women as a collective to integrate. However, you have much more opportunity for a woman to become very, very successful in the military. And, so there we go. Actually, I'm going to, I think, go back because I've talked for way too long. I want to stop and offer for questions here. So let's open up to questions. I can dig into any of these, variables a little more, talk about the different cases, talk about the so what. Let's open it up for questions. Yeah.
So I have a question that might not even require being gendered, but so when you keep referring to effectiveness, and I get that there are levels with that, but what did you use to describe what was effective, particularly on the combat arms side? So you said, I want to know if the unit is more effective with women in it or not. If the baseline was is a unit effective with men in it, what did you use to say a unit was successful?
So I used a three-part strategy for that. One, looking at Afghanistan, did it meet its stated tactical goals from what we have that are declassified? like did it actually meet commander's intent for goals? The next thing I looked at was sustained levels of unit readiness. So when you get into personnel files of how many people are med down, more or less, non-deployable, ineffective for whatever reason, whether it's physical or some other disciplinary action or financial or any of it. So just their state of readiness and being able to go at any given point in time. And then I looked at the promotability rate of the people in that unit as well, as a measure of effectiveness. Like, did you have, what percentage of the individuals within that unit were eligible to be promoted to the next rank, as a measure of going forward, as a measure of their effective individuals who are doing whatever is required of them of their military service.
So a follow-up then.
Yep.
So 2 out of those 3 though are internal to the military. I've never heard of an Army unit ever say it failed at anything, but because they get to choose their own, they get to qualify what success is. So when you talk about readiness, something the Army internally or any branch will say, we're ready because X, Y, Z, but those might not necessarily mean that they're ready for anything. And then the second one, the first one, according to the commander's intent, the commander is the one who gets to say whether or not you're successful. So every unit that's ever gone to Afghanistan, if they all said they were successful and we're still there, did you find it very difficult to say, okay, well then, if we had women involved, would we have won if the military can't even tell itself if it's...
I mean, it's a messy, complicated, which is the wonderfulness of dealing with this. And so when we talked about, success, I went back again to some of the original, like 2001, 2002, when we were saying our timeline is the original sort of clear hold build that we're gonna clear in, they had like an 18-month initial timeline. Well, okay, it's 4 years. Maybe we're not that effective. And I tried to look very specifically at micro level goals in this way, saying that we would have peace talks with the local people within 2 years. Okay, did they actually achieve that? Not looking at, are we still there? Because there are so many other confounding issues around that the military units really couldn't be held accountable for, like the fact that we cut all the money from USAID, and so we never developed anything. That we're still allowing an incentivization of the opium trade to exist, and so all of those things we couldn't. So I looked really at the micro level, like, did we hit the milestones, and also, which is hard to control for too, but casualty rates in part of our effectiveness of looking at that, if there was heavy casualties, versus not. Rates in part of the commander's intent effectiveness, I also looked at rates of IED placements outside of the areas in which we had village stability operations, because that's something that theoretically by bringing women in, we were supposed to get better at. So it wasn't just, did we win, but did we hit timelines for certain talks? Did we see a decrease in casualties? Did we see a decrease in violence at radius outside? And tried to keep this focused on as micro level as possible without trying to get, because there's so many large strategic variables that units just don't have, as I think we both know, nobody has control over, we can do a great job in a village and then we rotate out, and then I also controlled for deployment duration in that as well, and the number of deployments, the average number of deployments for units. And so units that there's sort of this sweet spot and I'm sure, I know you're very familiar with this, that after about 7 months in theater you start to see positive, but then at about like 14, 15 months, things go way down because everybody knows they're getting ready to leave. Mm-hmm. And so that was another part of it. You also had the units that had an average number of 2 to 3 deployments actually had the most success, like their members that had that versus their first. And then if you got beyond that, you started to degrade as well, because you have people that are just like sick of being there and it becomes Groundhog Day. So I controlled for all of that in there. And again, the biggest takeaway from this too is that something that I try to promote in this. It doesn't necessarily mean one's better or worse. It's the way that it happens, and if you get to the end of this, the so what of this is that process matters. And if process matters, when we're trying to work with our allies, because that's one of the big sticking points that come out of this from a very observable tactical level, was that when a U.S. infantry unit was going and working with Norwegians, they have a very, very different role of how gender is supposed to interact in society. And that created problems with and not from a big strategic planning level, but from a very tactical level of troops trying to interact and engage. And where these are theoretically, we all train as NATO, and we have these Western senses of what the military is supposed to act like. But this procedural difference of how women were brought in had a very meaningful impact on how these units actually engaged. I hope that answers. Yeah.
I was wondering, in your assessment, does it only look at cisgendered women, or does it include trans women as well? And if we're incorporating that, do we have a different outcome, or
I looked at women and however the military that I looked at defined women. Which, so for the U.S. it's cis women. In Norway it's all. And I did it based on the military's self-definition, just because that's how they report their numbers, and that's how they report, that's how they talk about it there. And so you have to go by their their standards. And it makes sense in Norway for them looking at it that way. That's because they're just very much, we're Norwegian. And that's it. They don't care. But in the U.S. there's more contention about it for sure. And in France it actually never. I raised the question once around just the LGBTQ community to try to look at, because I came at a lot of this too, even looking at the integration of racial minorities, sexual minorities, religious minorities as models for trying to set up what does integration process actually look like. And there's in the French case, it just doesn't exist, and it was really hard to get at. Does it not exist because of the strong Catholic background of the country, that it's something that they just won't talk about, or does it not exist because they don't see it as a factor? And that was one I couldn't quite get at.
Thank you.
And so, yeah. Yeah.
If you had done Israel as a case, what do you think you would have found?
So I purposely excluded Israel from this study for a few reasons. One is that the sort of geopolitics of Israel and why they believe they have to have a standing military is very different from other countries. That their belief in of having to have everybody in their military is a internalized belief for self-survival. That if they don't, that they are surrounded geographically by people who are going to attack them. And so they have a bit different there. But, so that's the primary reason I excluded them. But I think from the findings and I started off down the road of wanting to bring Israel in here, so I actually did spend some time over there engaging. And it's interesting. I mean, what you find is that women, all women serve, in Israel, but they still serve in very gendered ways, and it's a lot of women's service in Israel is performative for the West. Is what I found, that they have women serving. They have women as snipers, these women as these high-level intel officials, and it's a very, very, they see, and they'll self-describe it as being very performative. That this helps to elevate our status because we are modeling so in addition to, they're a very interesting case. So in addition to effectiveness and wanting to actually be able to fight and have all citizens able to fight because they feel threatened, for their survival, they also see their role as being very performative. They're saying we want to maintain the support, and it's sort of unspoken, but what's also said is that we know there might be some questionable things that's raising flags, so let's show that we are this progressive women empowering service. By and large though, women still serve in pretty traditional fields, and that's something that just by and large everywhere in the country happens. That there isn't there isn't any Western military that women are the majority or even close to a like plurality in any of the combat arms. It's not there, so we can put that out as like just the overall assumption. But in Israel often gets held up as this gender integrated military in which, yes, all women serve. They have the capacity to be able to serve in these roles, but still by and large, they serve very traditionally. It creates very interesting dynamics around citizenship when Israeli women go somewhere else, which is one of the, I think, the most interesting thing that actually the edited volume that we were talking about before, that myself and woman Kate Thomas, who's a sociologist down at the University of Charleston, are putting together, that's looking at how women veterans integrate, back into society in other countries. And that's where I think the Israel case becomes the most interesting, because there's, in most Western societies, the idea of being a veteran still carries a lot of masculine stuff. Like there's an assumption that men are veterans, especially men of a certain age or older. There's an assumption that they're veterans just because of wars that have happened. It doesn't exist for women. That is something that Israeli women like fundamentally reject, and they find very puzzling, troubling, confusing, like why that's, it's because of how they've been, especially women who grew up in Israel, like as opposed to women who grew up somewhere else and then went to Israel to do their time and then left again. But those who grew up and then went somewhere else, I mean, that's been one of the most interesting things, that there's this, the idea of military service has become very degendered. That it's not hooked to the male side anymore, that this isn't something that like makes men better. Yeah.
So you picked the female engagement teams, which is a really small percentage, very kind of niche thing within the U.S. military. Why did you opt for that as opposed to like a logistics unit who would have been integrated for a long time and would be performing missions that you could?
Yeah, because it allowed me to look at the so to go more into the the research design on this, to look at some of these effectiveness measures that we talked about before. I looked at village stability operations that were led by U.S., French, and Norwegian groups over a series of time. And so those were the women that were specifically brought in to do that. And what I was looking at is when you pick women specifically to do a job, whether it's female engagement team or like the French, because it's also very close to the French parallel of, we created these specialized infantry units to go do village stability operations because they had a lot of women in them. That it allowed for that very micro study as opposed to looking at just the military writ large. So that was the reason why I focused on them there. Yeah.
I have a question about the durability. You said durability was important because it's not only how long were women lasting in the military in terms of rank or time in service, but also what legacy they left on the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So the CSTs that were attached to Special Operations Forces.
Yeah.
My question then is, do you believe that they're the ones that were getting the most press, right? The things you've heard in the last 2 years about women integration is Ranger School graduation, and they write books on the CSTs.
Yeah.
But that's still trying to fit into the paradigm that the cultural valuation of the military is on the people who get to do the most fighting. And so that the value of women needs to then be fit into that as a measure of effectiveness. So in your research, did you find that actually focusing too much on trying to fit in with special operations is actually more harmful because it still fits within the paradigm that men and women doesn't matter, but masculinity and belonging to
and fighting matters, right? And so this is one where it's, I mean, that side raises more questions than answers because it's so new that women are actually have the opportunity to publicly do this. What I found in looking at sort of the legacy that women had was that in the environments in which women were, in which seniority and rank, and more than just seniority and rank, but really impactful seniority and rank, so the ability to get to be not just a general, but a commandant or a chief of staff, one who can actually set strategy, set culture, that when that is dependent on being part of the combat arms, then you have this sort of issue where you have to fit a certain mold, certain paradigm, versus if you're ability to achieve seniority and rank has to do with other factors, not just whether or not you're part of a infantry unit. That definitely had, with just the ability for non-traditional, like not even women, but just non-traditional military attitudes and cultures, what we think of as traditional military attitudes and cultures, to have an impact matters. And so it's a bit of a chicken and an egg issue that I think we see here, that is and the wonderful endogeneity problem of, because we only promote infantry officers, do we then only have infantry culture? Or is it because the culture of the military is so infantry centric and we're always like, this is the main effort, that we only promote infantry officers to become generals? And that's one of those nuts that's hard to crack. And what I did find is that that's hard to change without basically a crisis of some sort to the military. And to go to the French case where you see this changing the most, World War II fundamentally shifted the way the French organized their militaries. And a big part of that was during the resistance, that women were the primary members of the resistance. And when they asked why, like when women were, there was a famous trial of a group of women who were arrested. And they were actually arrested not because of like being part of the resistance, but because it was actually illegal for women to own guns in France at the time. So the Vichy regime got them on having guns on their person. And they had been like some of the largest assassins of Nazi officers in France. And they were asked, they're like, why did you do this? You knew it was illegal. And the rallying cry really became, we did this because the men got us defeated. The all-male army lost. And so we need to do something different. And so but the crisis to the military, I mean, it was they had come off of, this wasn't their first big major loss in recent times, but that started to fundamentally shift the way that they structured their promotions, who they brought into like strategic leadership plans. They had also were suffering in Algeria and Vietnam, around that same year. So they took these defeats really as saying, okay, we've had a history of promoting infantry officers, particularly from a certain class. It's not working. And so it's hard. Some sort of crisis usually has to happen for that to change, just historically. And I mean, either that or like a lot of noise from the inside, but there's very, very few, even the most forward-leaning, I often rely back to the Marine Corps just for my own personal experience, because that's what I was. Even like our current, or just recently, they both just retired, but commandant and assistant commandant who really worked to try get out in front after all the Marines United stuff happens. I was very close with the assistant commandant, who was one of my former squadron commanders. But I had even asked him, like around, what are your thoughts about non-infantry commandants? Because we've had one ever. And he's like, well, that's never going to happen. That's a bad idea. And even in the most, and this is someone who is probably among the more progressive, for lack of a better term, 4-stars that we had, still was like, no, that probably should be an infantry guy who's there. And so there's that really ingrained culture that drives the way that success looks. And so it's how success is actually modeled, and without some large crisis that may not change. And this is, if you like this, you should take my class next semester to get more into what drives culture, and we'll get much more into what effectiveness actually means. Yeah.
So I was actually wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more on the France case where it says women are needed to do what men cannot do, or like,
yes,
they specifically need women to do certain roles? Like, I have an idea in my head, but
yeah,
you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah. So women, it comes out of a lot of this resistance side, and just the way they changed after a combination really of World War II, Algeria, and Vietnam being 3 pretty significant events in very short succession that led to pretty significant infantry failures. they reshaped the way they looked at what does it mean to be a soldier and what does infantry tactics actually mean. And that they started to realize that conventional war was not something that they were going to necessarily go fight, and that much more of the world was going to be shaped in crisis intervention, irregular warfare, especially like their kind of confusion around ending their colonies and like what is war going to look like. And so they part of their whole creation of infantry units had a very gendered component of realizing that no matter where we're going to go fight in the world, again, it's probably going to involve a more urban or village environment where we're going to have to go house to house, we're going to have to engage with populations. And so there was this recognition that, they had seen, in World War II, the women were very effective at killing Nazis. And it was because they acted like French women. Like they just acted like French women. They worked their way, literally like flirted and sweet talked their way into Nazi barracks and then just went and shot them all. And so, but then if you flip it to Algeria, they largely got defeated by women. Because who weren't checked through checkpoints, and there's the famous scenes in the Battle of Algiers, which is so stark to still look at this, that women just walked on by. And so that created a both strategic and tactical culture in which women became, they're like, there's a value to being a woman, but also being trained as an infantry soldier. Because they realized that we need to train the women who we need to go do this, we need to train them in such a way that they are effective. We don't want to just say, hey, woman off the street, go fight Nazis, even though that's what happened. But, let's train them, but let's maintain the fact that they are women soldiers. As opposed to, I think that the largest contrast to that is the Norwegian case, where women were early on integrated into infantry units, but it was you're not a woman anymore. Yeah.
You mentioned that it generally takes a major crisis for a military to pursue some sort of major gender reforms.
Or the major anything reforms.
Major anything reforms. But in the United States, we've certainly had crises, whether it's the Vietnam War, the Iraq War. Why haven't we seen the same sort of gender reforms?
There's $1 million question.
There are crises and there are crises.
Right. I mean, that's there are. It depends on what we view as a crisis, and I think to the point earlier of militaries don't like to admit defeat. Militaries really it takes a lot for a military to say that we did something really, really wrong, and that requires us to fundamentally have to change the way we are structured and operate. And yes, we've had, I would call Vietnam and Iraq from a structural military perspective debacles more than crises, where you can definitely argue that we made incorrect decisions, that even in Korea where we retreated or attacked in another direction, but I think for a large scale defeat hasn't happened at that level where up to the senior leadership, everybody within the structure has suffered defeat in that way. I think it was in the back.
So from that perspective, it sounds like we're taking for granted that the U.S. military is doing something fundamentally wrong in the way they're integrating gender. Is that?
No, as I just said, it's not a value judgment of right or wrong. It's explaining differences, and that's it. When you look at why do we see differences, this is like the integration of the military culture versus there's also the way that women in the United States view equality and success is different than in some of these other countries that we also have to take into account. And so the emphasis here isn't on saying it's right or wrong, it's good or bad, it's how do we explain these differences that exist? That because, despite the fact that we have said, okay, all roles are open to women in the military, women in the military in the United States have integrated in a fundamentally different way than they have in other Western countries. And so they are employed, they're written into strategic doctrine in a different way. And the sort of the crisis leading to change is more in regards to like that high level culture of masculinity. It's not saying, maybe it's right to say, if you want to be successful in the military, you need to be hyper masculine. I mean, maybe that, if we want to look, maybe that's right, and maybe other countries are doing it wrong. What's presented here is that it occurs differently, and understanding why the differences exist is important for operational planning, for strategic planning, for on the ground interaction with different militaries, you can get even more notes for how you recruit. It becomes important to understand differently, and often we try to rely on other case studies of saying, okay, well, there's a lot of women in the Hungarian military. How are they recruiting? Is that really how we should be recruiting? Or are there other, both domestic gendered cultures and military strategic cultures that are going to prevent us from actually doing things in the same way? I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
I think it's really cool that you decided to study this because you were like, I'm grappling with this issue and I keep thinking about it. And in that vein, was there anything about your research that was either really surprising or didn't jive with your own personal experience in the military?
I mean, like for the not driving with my own, I actually had a really good experience in the military, and I think that there's a lot of women in the U.S. military who don't, and it actually makes doing some of that research really hard. Like, even in my DAC, it's like hearing a lot of these super, super negative stories. I mean, I had some issues, but nothing. By and large, I had a good. Like, I always had really good COs and like really good squadron. Like, so that was always like how visceral some of those experiences were tough. Norway was the biggest surprise for me, just in general. And I think because they are so often held up as this model of gender equality that exists. But it raises a lot of questions really as to get deeper as to what does gender equality actually mean? Does gender flattening mean, and talking to men the same way? And I think that's where it was very interesting, wherein both France and the US, there's this very recognition that men and women were different. And there was a lot of focus around, what the standards are, how women meet meet physical standards in particular. Like, that was a big focus of the conversations in both of those sides. Like, that never came up in this case. And the, men in Norway, and a lot of it has to do, again, this is what we're talking about, the other kind of cultural domestic preconditions. There's also a legal requirement for men in Norway who become fathers to take paternity leave. Like, by law, you have to. It's not an option or a choice. Like, but it creates a very different environment, even with regards to what sort of socialized performative gender roles are. Because it's has anybody spent time in Oslo, Norway? Like, one of the, hanging out downtown Oslo, in the afternoon is one of the, it still, baffles me. The guys with strollers, everywhere. It is this, there are, they call it the daddy quota. You have to take it, you're forced to take it. And and you're actually, so this came up, this cultural idea came up in the, academic world a lot, because I have one of my cohort mates is doing a postdoc over in Norway right now, and he and his wife are, expecting, and there's this sort of, joke's the right way, but whatever it is, among academia, that when male professors take paternity leave, they get to write a book, and when female professors take maternity leave, they gotta take care of a kid, that same, but they're when he's getting ready to go, he's actually no work that he produces during his paternity leave time will be accepted. Wow. And so it creates this, that's how serious it is. And so there's this very different just idea of what men and women do. And again, we're not saying it's good, bad, or other. It's different. And so it's become very flat. I mean, even the way people dress is, both men and women dress very like androgynously. There, you know, like, but very the same. You know, it's very, and so that was very. It's always held up as this sort of model of equality. Well, is it equality or is it like flattening? Like what does equality really mean? And that's something that sort of drove me to want to dig deeper, like why, you know, and it's what really rose up to this idea of what are these sort of initial beliefs about equality. So I went into this, you know, thinking that, okay, well, all, you know, Western countries all believe in women's equality. You know, that there's this fundamental belief that men and women are equal, that's not something that's like a cultural problem. But then digging in, it's so, the beliefs about equality are so different and what that actually means. But it's not always good either, because they ran into, when we go into the sort of very basic, low-level tactical issues they ran into, is that because there is such, in Afghanistan, go back to that side, there's such this ingrained belief that men and women are exactly the same, it became very hard for them to operate in a society that believes very fundamentally that men and women are not only completely different, but don't belong in the same physical location. And so there were issues. I mean, that these are troops that have bunked together, literally in the same open squad base. Like when we talk about like shared berthing and things like this, like all soldiers share just an open squad bay, and it's just completely normal. And they do not see it, they fundamentally don't believe it's an issue. And now all of a sudden they get into a tactical environment and women are forced to go somewhere else. You know, like that they're viewed as women. It starts to create other issues around tactical effectiveness that they have problems with because they've never thought this way. And it's one of the reasons that the Hunter troop that they created, which are people familiar with the Hunter troop in Norway at all? So Norway created a all-woman special operations unit. You know, this is sort of like this learning coming out of Afghanistan. Okay, we need to do this. Like we need to do something that is women specific to try to figure this out. And so they have a, you know, the Jägertruppen is like their equivalent of like our Rangers, or the closest thing to put it to. And there are women who have been in it, and again, not a large number, but there are some that have gone through. So they created one that was just all women. And they did the exact same training, exact same everything. And they're like, okay, so now we've made this all women unit that does it. Well, they never deployed them anywhere because none of the women wanted to go. Like it became this whole, like they basically revolted and were like, we're never going to be able to, we won't be respected when we get home. Like we're never going to be able to get jobs after this because people are going to think that we're women. And it was a very interesting, you know, talking to these women who were going, that their fundamental belief was like, no, I can't go do something that is being done because I'm a woman. Like that is so foreign to the way that I think that it was it's not like, oh, it's beneath me or it's something, you know, that, but they just couldn't fundamentally figure out how to do it. So it's it creates some of that, you know, that was one of my biggest surprises of like, oh, they're held up as like this sort of idyllic, like, let's be like Norway, where men are pushing strollers down the streets of Oslo, and, you know, the woman, you know, a female colonel is the head of Norwegian forces in Afghanistan. So it's, you know, it's interesting in that way. Yeah.
Does time or understanding how to employ the capability by the staff or the commanders have anything to do with like changes in interactive results? It does.
And you know, I pull this out into, I start, you know, basically this sort of process cycle looking at, you know, how these three factors interact, and then look at the changes to policies, tactics, and culture. And I divide them up into basically 10-year segments starting after World War II. When I go through this to look at experience, and what you see is, yes, like the more understanding and experience that you have, like the quicker these interactive effects can actually take place and women can be employed.
Okay, this is good timing actually, because what we usually like to do also, even though you'll try and eat at the very end, if any students want to come up and
Yes.
talk to you
Oh, yeah.
one-on-one and
Please.
ask questions,
Please
more than
don't
welcome to
hesitate.
do so. Thank you for visiting us here and
course.
SSP Lunch. You obviously have a group of lucky students who have you now and have an opportunity to do so again next semester. And a fascinating project, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.